Hello, brothers and sisters. We're looking at Genesis. Genesis, the beginning, the origin, the source, the original source of everything. In the last video, I asked the question, what is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Theology says it's possibly an apple tree. Theology says maybe a pear tree, apricot, plum. In other words, the voices of theology relegate the tree of the knowledge of good and evil to a physical, natural fruit. However, when I look at that, if God's command was so emphatic, so direct, so absolute that he said, do not eat of it or touch it, or in the day that you do, you'll die. And remember, up to this point, everything that God had created was good. It was good, it was good. The man, the woman, as long as they subjected themselves to the voice of God, they would have never died. Death was never mentioned. Death was never mentioned. Think about that. Death was never mentioned until God said, and until God identified a specific tree that had the knowledge of good and evil. And only God, only Yahweh, only the supreme deity could make that distinction between what was good and what was evil. Only that which is eternal can make the distinction between what is eternal and what is death, or brings death into existence. Remember, the Old Testament prophet said, and speaking for the voice of God, he said, I create good and I create evil. That doesn't mean that God is evil. That word creation there means that he makes the distinction between what is good and what is evil. And we find him doing that in the book of Genesis. This is where it started. This is where he made that specific distinction between what was created good and what was created that had the ability, the capability by choice to become good and evil. So let's just relax. As I said before, take the theological blinders off, the philosophical blinders off, all the religious influences that we've been bombarded with all of our life. Take them blinders off and just relax in the Spirit of God. Look at the scriptures and let them speak to us, because the scriptures are inspired. They're already inspired. They're already sanctioned by God. I'm not. But if I subject myself to that inspiration, if I allow that inspiration to reveal to me, to talk to me, then we'll see what the voice of God is actually saying. The tree of the knowledge. That's a key word right there. Natural fruit doesn't have knowledge of good and evil. I mean, that's absurd. And then, if I might interject here to say, if something so identified that could bring death, how come it's never mentioned in the 10 Commandments or the 613 Commandments? You won't find it. If it's a physical piece of fruit, you will not find it. But if something that the man and the woman partook of was the very thing that would bring death, wouldn't it be mentioned again in the law? Of course it would. God didn't say, oh, I forgot to put that in there. No. So it had knowledge. There's many scriptures on knowledge. One scripture that comes to mind is that knowledge puffeth up, but charity edifies. So knowledge in that context has a voice, as well as charity has a voice. So it has knowledge, which means it has a voice. It can speak good and it can speak evil. How many's heard the saying? I'm sure you have. I mean, the adage has been around for a long, long time. A picture paints 1,000 words. A picture says 1,000 words. Many times words, we find it difficult to interpret, to decipher when we hear words, because they're having to go through, those words are having to navigate through all of this stuff that's in our brain. But when we look at a picture, it's just like if I say, Cain killed Abel. Those are words, and we say, well, I believe that. But if I show you a picture of Cain picking up a rock or whatever object he used and just smashing Abel's skull, and blood pours out everywhere, and he just keeps beating him till he's dead. If I could show you a picture of that, it would have more impact on you than just me saying Cain killed Abel. Because a picture paints 1,000 words. Maybe, I think the Chinese said it like this: one picture paints 10,000 words, something like that. But it's the same context of the adage. If I tell you Jesus died on the cross, those are words. It's not that you don't believe it, but if you watch the film that Mel Gibson put out called The Passion of Christ, and you see that, with your eyes, you see that bloody, beaten body. The impact goes beyond just me saying Jesus died on the cross. A picture paints 10,000 words. In other words, many times the voice of a picture pulls us into a whole different dynamic. And so I want you to picture this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It has a voice, it has intent, it has purpose. It has the knowledge of good and evil. Now, of course, God has the knowledge of good and evil. If he didn't, he wouldn't have been able to make the distinction. So where did that knowledge of good and evil begin? What was its genesis? What's the origin? We've got to find out, because it has a voice. And that voice impacted Adam and Eve so much that it brought death into existence. And we'll get into that in the next video. Until then, stay in the peace and love of Yeshua.